He kept the house. He kept everything we owned. But there was one thing he was never going to keep: my silence. Asterisk asterisk. I kept the idea he had laughed at. I was standing in the garage the night Grant told me our marriage was over, a soldering iron in one hand and a stack of unpaid invoices in the other. He had already packed 2 suitcases. He didn't even bother looking at what was spread across the workbench behind me: 11 months of prototypes, sketches, testing notes, and a patent application I had completed at 2 in the morning after he had gone to bed. "You're wasting your life on that thing," he said, motioning toward the workbench as if it were some useless old appliance that needed to be thrown away. "Nobody's going to buy a smart irrigation sensor from a housewife with a community college degree." Then he walked out and took the car with the good tires. I was left with the garage, the sensor, and $42 in a checking account he hadn't gotten around to emptying yet. My name is Adrienne Colton, and I want to tell you what happened during the 7 years that followed that night, because the ending involves Grant standing in the lobby of my company wearing a borrowed tie and asking my head of HR for a second interview. On paper, the divorce left me with almost nothing. Grant kept the house in Ashford Park, the truck, and most of our savings because his lawyer was better than mine, and because I was simply too exhausted to fight over furniture. What I kept was the prototype, a soil moisture sensor that connected to your phone and told you exactly when your crops needed water instead of forcing you to guess. I had built the first version from parts one bought at a hardware store and a secondhand circuit board. For the first 2 years after the divorce, I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat and ran the sensor business out of that same garage, the garage I had fought to keep in the settlement precisely because Grant thought the whole idea was worthless. I want to be honest about how difficult those years were. I sold my grandmother's jewelry to pay for the first manufacturing run. I ate a lot of rice. 9 investors rejected me before the 10th finally listened. His name was Walter Iverson, a quiet man who ran a small agricultural investment fund. He watched my demonstration for 4 minutes before saying, "This is the first pitch I've heard all week that isn't trying to reinvent something that already works." He wrote me a check, and a month later I hired my first 2 employees, Priya Nakamura, a systems engineer, and Curtis Boyd, a sales representative who had spent years selling irrigation pipe door to door and knew nearly every farmer within 200 miles by first name. By year 4, we had 11 employees and a contract with a regional agricultural cooperative. By year 6, we'd expanded into 3 states and moved out of the garage into an actual office building with our company name, Colultura Systems, displayed across the front door. And I want to make something clear. I never threw a party or gave an interview bragging about how far I'd come. I simply kept building. Grant, meanwhile, went through 2 different jobs, a used car dealership that eventually folded, and according to people from our old neighborhood who still kept in touch with me, a very public falling out with his mother. Diane had never forgiven me for taking the garage and had spent years telling anyone willing to listen that the sensor company had really been her son's idea, that Grant had been the one who believed in it first. There was one detail that still made me quietly laugh whenever I thought about it. Grant had absolutely no idea that the company he was applying to belonged to me. Colultura Systems didn't put my face on its website. I didn't do press interviews, and I rarely appeared publicly. So when his resume landed on my head of HR's desk 11 months ago, all it said was that he was applying for the regional sales manager position at Colultura Systems. His previous employer was listed as a defunct auto dealership, followed by a company he described as an irrigation technology consulting firm. As far as I could determine, he'd spent only 3 months there trying to convince farmers to purchase a competitor's inferior sensor before that company folded too. My head of HR, a sharp woman named Renata Silva, brought me his resume herself. She had noticed the last name and asked whether there was any connection. I sat with the resume for 2 days before finally giving her an answer. Then I told her the truth. Grant Sutcliffe was my ex-husband. I wanted him interviewed exactly like every other candidate, and under no circumstances was anyone to tell him who owned the company. I wasn't doing it to humiliate him. I was doing it because I was curious. In the coldest, most clinical way possible, I wanted to know whether the man who once told me I was wasting my life would recognize what I'd built if my name wasn't attached to it. I didn't rush the process. Renata conducted 2 rounds of interviews over 6 weeks, following exactly the same procedure we used for every other candidate. Grant made it to the final round. I watched the recording of his interview alone in my office with the door closed. He talked about understanding the agricultural mindset and knowing how to read a farmer. He spoke confidently about sales, relationships, and market trends. He never once asked who had founded the company. That told me more than anything else ever could about how little curiosity he'd had about me. The final interview was scheduled. Renata asked if she could sit in on the final interview. Grant walked into the conference room, wearing a tie I didn't recognize. His hair was slightly grayer, but he still carried himself with the same easy confidence he'd had on the night he packed his suitcases. He didn't recognize me at first. I'd changed my hair, and 7 years can do a lot to a person's face. But the moment I looked at him and said, "Hello, Grant," I watched the color drain from his face. Something settled quietly inside my chest. It wasn't exactly triumph. It was something calmer than that. "Adrian," he said slowly, "this is your company." "It has been for 6 years," I replied. "I built it out of the garage. The same garage you told me was a waste of my life." For the next 30 seconds, he tried on 3 different versions of himself. First, he became apologetic, then charming, then, almost imperceptibly, accusatory, as though my success were somehow a trick I'd played on him. "I always believed in that sensor," he said. "I told people about it for years." I let the words hang in the room without answering. I already knew what version of the story he'd been telling. 18 months earlier, at a mutual friend's funeral, I'd overheard Diane telling someone that the idea had actually been Grant's, and that I'd simply taken it and built a company around it after the divorce. "You're welcome to finish the interview process like everyone else," I told him. "Renata will let you know either way." Then I stood, thanked him for his time, and walked out before he could say anything else. That was the entire confrontation. There was no shouting, no long speech about everything he'd cost me, no list of every sacrifice I'd made. I'd waited 7 years for that moment, and when it finally arrived, I didn't need to raise my voice for the truth to have an impact. He didn't get the job, not because I blacklisted him. I had genuinely removed myself from the final decision. Curtis, who now ran our entire sales division, had concerns about Grant's answers regarding long-term client relationships. He described them as shallow during the debrief before he even knew what Grant meant to me. I found that out later, and somehow that meant more to me than anything I could have arranged myself. For a while, I worried Grant might turn the whole thing into his own story. I thought he'd tell people I'd rigged the interview process, or, worse, that I deliberately humiliated him in that conference room. But that's not what happened. A former colleague of his named Peter Holloway, a man who had remained friendly with both of us, told me several months later that Grant had become unusually quiet about the whole situation. He'd taken a job with a smaller logistics company across the state, and according to Peter, he had completely stopped mentioning the garage or the sensor. Apparently, the subject embarrassed him now in a way it never had before. That was its own kind of ending. I didn't need Grant to beg for forgiveness. I didn't need him to admit that he'd been wrong. I simply needed him to stop rewriting our past out loud. Diane called me 2 weeks later. It was the first time she'd spoken directly to me since the divorce. She didn't apologize. Instead, she wanted to know whether I deliberately humiliated her son. I calmly explained that I'd allowed a completely fair hiring process to run its course. Then I told her that if the process felt humiliating to Grant, perhaps it said more about the story he'd been telling than it did about anything I'd actually done. She hung up on me. I haven't heard from her since. Meanwhile, the company kept growing. We reached 40 employees that spring, launched a second product line designed for greenhouse operators, and signed a distribution agreement that brought our sensors into 6 additional states. Walter Iverson, the investor who had written that first check years earlier, attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony for our new distribution warehouse. In front of a room full of employees, partners, and local officials, he called Colultra Systems the best investment he'd ever made. Not because of the technology, he said, because of the woman who refused to fold when everything was stacked against her. Priya, who joined me back when we had only 11 employees and a garage with a leaking roof, is now our head of engineering. She has 3 patents of her own filed under the company name. Curtis runs sales for the entire company, and he still tells new hires about the farmer who purchased our very first unit with nothing more than a handshake because he trusted Curtis's word more than any technical specification. Last month, I stood inside that same garage. We'd kept it. In fact, I'd eventually bought the house from its new owners specifically so I could keep the garage. I know how strange that probably sounds. I was standing there holding a plaque the county had given us for Local Business of the Year. And I thought about Grant standing in that exact spot 7 years earlier, telling me I was wasting my life. I didn't feel angry anymore. Mostly I felt grateful. Because some part of me had needed something to prove wrong. He kept the house in Ashford Park. He kept the truck. And he kept the version of our history where he could tell people he believed in me all along. I kept the garage. I kept the idea. And I kept every quiet, difficult year it took to turn that idea into something real.